And now we're ready for part two of diagramming the scene. So we know how to search the scene, we know how to photograph the scene, and now we're ready to sketch it. So some of the things that we're going to need in order to sketch the scene, and these are tools that we're going to have to be fairly familiar with in order to make our crime scene sketch come out correct. So a pencil and an eraser, obviously, we want to work fast, and that sometimes leads to mistakes. So we want to be able to erase it. And if we do it in pen or marker to start with, then it just makes a mess and makes everything a little bit more difficult. So some kind of paper, preferably graph paper. Some people like to just have a blank slate to work with, and if you're the completely clear paper kind of person, that's great. But the benefit of graph paper is it's already set up in quarter-inch squares, and most of our scales are going to be quarter-inch equals 1 foot. So the graph paper actually helps you maintain your scale even on your rough sketch. Some kind of clipboard. You're working in a fluid environment. You're moving around a crime scene. You're um, going to need some way that you can record all this information clearly, and having some kind of clipboard or way to write on and keep these measurements is going to help you. A measuring tape. You believe it or not, reading a measuring tape is not common knowledge. You'll find out that every measuring tape is made just a little bit differently. And if you're not familiar with what the markings are, sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. A compass, okay, not talking about the um, pointy end and pencil drawing circles compass from math class, but an actual directional compass because we want to know what direction is north, south, east, and west as far as our sketch goes, and it does make a difference. And then some kind of ruler or straight edge. You don't have to be an art major in order to do a crime scene sketch, but we do want to be able to use these when we get finished. And what we're going to use them for is show to a jury in order to help prove our case. And the jury has to be able to see things clearly. So nice straight lines makes it look like you took the time to investigate correctly, and a sloppy drawing tells the jury that you probably did a sloppy investigation. So we're going to look at several types of sketching. There's four types that we're going to talk about: an overhead, cross projection, elevation, and perspective. And we'll get into those individually. So let's look at an overhead sketch. As you can imagine, it's going to be an overhead view from above. And there's lots and lots of cool camera rigs now that will let you take overhead views. You can even use drone technology to get a nice overhead photograph. But these are going to be overhead sketches that are going to give you an idea of what the floor plan looks like if you were floating above the room or above the crime scene. So in this one, you can tell it's a nice, clean sketch. Very, very easy to tell things like where the door is, where the bed is, where the dresser and the window are. Notice the window is just a thin rectangle inserted in the wall. And we've got our north indicator. But as clean and clear as this is, there are some issues with an overhead sketch that you just can't get the detail you need. For example, how big is the window? Okay, how tall is the dresser? Is the bed a bunk bed and the body is on the bottom bed or the top bed? It's really, really difficult to sort of get an idea of height in an overhead sketch, but that's not really the intent. The intent is to show you a basic layout so that if we were narrating to the jury and trying to explain to them where things were located in the room, this would be a nice, simple way to do that. The next one is cross projection, or sometimes called the exploded view. So if you've ever created some kind of folding box diorama type project in elementary school or middle school, this is going to look very, very familiar. Imagine you were to take a box and you were to cut it in the corners and fold all four sides out flat. What it does is it allows you to see that same overhead view of your crime scene, but notice now we have the benefit of seeing the actual walls. Okay, we've got the window and the door and the bed and the dresser the same as we did before, but now we can see things like how tall the window is, the added evidence of bullet holes noted on each of the end walls. This now becomes really, really important because the bullet holes are evidence that we didn't have in our overhead sketch that we're probably going to need in our investigation. So it gives us a little bit more detail, and it's still that nice, clean, clear type of sketch. Now, an elevation sketch and a perspective sketch sometimes work together. Elevation is going to be a side view of the sketch. If we were viewing the other ones from above, this one we're looking at it from the side so that we can get those heights. The walls on the exploded view are actually side views or elevations. So we've combined overviews and elevations in our exploded view. And then perspective, as you can imagine, if you've taken any art classes, you probably had to deal with vanishing points or horizon lines and things like that. So let's take a look at what they actually look like. This would be an elevation sketch of our bed from the previous sketches. Notice now we get details like exactly how high the bed was, the bullet hole height behind the bed, which really becomes important because if we're trying to match up stories from some of our victims or suspects or witnesses, it becomes important to know things like where were the bullet holes? Was somebody standing or laying down when they were shot or when they fired a shot? And it really helps to tell the story if we can get an accurate picture of where all this evidence is located. This would be an elevation sketch of an outside. If we were trying to explain how somebody tripped when they were coming out of the residence, or that we found footprints or blood drops on the steps outside the house, it helps to have this graphic so that we know exactly what we're talking about and maybe make a little bit more sense of somebody's story if we understand that the walkway and the front porch are not on the same level. And this would be your perspective sketch. Okay, notice that the lines in the corner meet at an angle, so it gives us that three-dimensional ability to figure out exactly what the size of this dresser is. Is it important in the case? Maybe, maybe not. That's where you, as the investigator, have to decide which sketches you're going to use. You have all of these sketches in your investigative arsenal, and it's up to you to decide which ones are going to tell the best story and which ones are going to help prove the different points of the case that you need to prove. Now, what we're going to do as we go along is we're going to keep track of all of our evidence in what's called a rough sketch. Think of a rough sketch as just your notes page while you're roaming around the crime scene and recording evidence. You can see all kinds of different things in here, but some of the more important factors are that this sketch is not drawn to scale. Okay, remember we talked about the straight lines on the ruler? It's not as important on your rough sketch. You can have these curves, you can have these sort of oblong shaped items, and that's not really that big of a deal. You notice these little, they look like triangular hats. They're actually locations from where photographs were taken. Okay, so if you can imagine the investigator was standing here photographing this direction, and you can actually label those with a number that corresponds to the actual photograph. So we can say, if you're looking at this photograph, here's the angle that it was taken and get an idea. Notice they've gone in and they've drawn little things like the phone. That's not really as crucial. What we want is more the measurements. We want to know total length of the room, width of the room. We want to know things like how wide and how long is the couch, lengths of bookcases, lengths of doors, how far is the door from the desk, if there's anything like a structure like a fireplace or a window. We want to know the distances of all of those structures. And they've also gone in and they've labeled all of their evidence. So if you've got evidence like this wine glass here that's labeled A, it needs to be the exact same on all of our documents. So item A should always be this glass. If we've got other items, notice there's one there labeled F. They've actually got the phone labeled, things like that. This is just a way for us to record notes and get an idea of exactly what all we need to include in our final sketch. So a rough sketch should have some common factors. It should have who prepared it, who did the sketch. That's going to become important in court because you can't introduce this sketch in the courtroom unless you have the person who actually drew it. You want the case number that links it to the investigation. You want the type of incident. Was it a murder? Was it a burglary? Was it a robbery? Was it a theft? Something like that. The date and time, the weather and lighting conditions. Remember, we talked about those are important for the jury to know what kind of conditions the investigation was completed under. Were the pictures taken because it was, do they look dark because it's dark in the room? Were they taken because it was dark outside? We want compass directions, okay, north, south, east, and west. A lot of times it's okay just to sort of give an idea of which way north is, and hopefully everybody can figure out the rest of the directions from there. The objects are evidence that we noted earlier. We want to make sure and label those correctly in our sketches. And then we want measurements of everything, not just the evidence. We want measurements of the rooms, the windows, the doors. It's going to be really hard to do an elevation sketch later if you didn't get the height of things like windows and doors and dressers when you were doing your initial investigation. The distances between objects, the relationship of different objects, and then a key or legend so that we can get an idea of what these markings are on our sketch without cluttering it up by labeling it inside the drawing. So this is an idea of what a rough sketch could look like. Notice we've got our information at the top that tells who did it, when they did it, what kind of scene it was. We make sure and note that it's not drawn to scale. Okay, from our sketch that we had earlier, we've got all of our items like our dresser and our bed, but now we have measurements. We know exactly what size they are, and they measure to the major bends or points on the victim. So we've got this foot marking here, foot measurement here, another head measurement. So now that we can put this body back in its regular position, we've got things like the width of the door, okay, the width of the window, all these different measurements that we noted. And they've gone further and they've labeled them down here so that we can keep track of those later. All right, so that's the end of part one for our different types of sketches, and we will move on from there.